All right, man. So what's going on with you, man? I know Florida had a near miss with a hurricane. How
Yeah,
did you guys make out?
I think the Bahamas took a good amount of the damage on
Yeah,
that one.
that's to say the least, right?
Yeah, that's the story that people are really going to talk about. I haven't even heard anything about it since it went up north. We dodged a bullet on that
Yeah,
hurricane.
my buddy from down there, he said he lives over. I forget if he's over by Sweetwater, somewhere over in that down there. He said all you guys really got was some rain and wind.
That's it. That's it. It was just a little bit of a little bit of water flowing through us, and then sunshine. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
here right
So
now.
a regular day basically, because Miami, it could like at a
It's
minute's notice, it'll be like torrential pours, and then it's beach weather again.
there's not even a cloud in sight. So we're
That's
doing great.
Yeah, that's pretty fortunate. So, let's dive right in, man. Like, first off, I want to bring this one up because we talk about conspiracy theories sometimes, and somebody brought up this whole idea of like weather modification, which not that I don't believe that weather modification isn't possible. I'm sure it is, and I'm sure the tech exists. I
Mhm.
always kind of like pause at saying they used it for this, they used it for that, because you just don't, you couldn't possibly know that, right? But the big theory is that the Epstein Island was down there, and they used some kind of weather modification tool to like try to wipe the island. What do you think about that idea?
What do you mean by try to wipe the island?
I don't know. That's just a conspiracy theory I heard that maybe there were still things on there that they could have found. I know the FBI showed up and like there was nothing there. The island, his compound had been like scrubbed, all his hard drives were gone. But I
Well,
don't know. It's like they said that there might have been some stuff left there that they still could have went and investigated, but they used this weather modification to try to destroy the island and bury it all.
yeah. Well, look, power opens people up to suspicion, right? When something big happens to someone powerful, there's always doubts about what how it happened, right? It's not a regular person, so the circumstances aren't the same. So then you would probably expect, at least a large amount of the population does expect, for the circumstances to be different when it has something to do with a person in a position of power, especially someone who is related to two presidents and British royalty, right? And I mean, on top of that, if we just take a clear look at the circumstances that we've already seen, it's weird enough already, right? The thing about people is when they see something weird, right? Like the president got assassinated, right? Like Kennedy, they're like, okay, that's about as weird a thing as can happen is the president of the United States dying. But then we make it weirder, right? We put a conspiracy theory up. Well, this is how it really happened. This is who assassinated, and there's all kinds of speculation, which may or may not be true. But in the Epstein case, it's already weird enough. I mean, if you take a look at it, I mean, there's Pedophile Island, which is real, which is confirmed, which no one denies. And then there's even in Pedophile Island, you see even pictures, paintings that are just the weird. Have you seen those paintings that I'm talking about?
I got to see one. I was like scrolling through some things maybe like last week, but I really didn't look into it. I did hear about it. They had like some strange sculptures and artwork throughout the island that seemed kind of like paganistic and stuff like that.
Well, what they had, right, was and there's two of them, and they're both presidential, right? These are the ones that I'm talking about. So the first one is one of Bush, right, and it's Bush sitting down on the floor like a kid, and there's two paper planes, right, and he's playing with one of them, and then there's like this Jenga tower, right, and it's fallen down, and one of the planes is on the ground with the little pieces of the Jenga tower that's fallen down, which seems, I mean, like a very clear indication
Whoa,
of
that's
11.
dark, man.
Right. It seems like it's a sort of a shout out to 9/11. And then,
Yeah.
and then there's the other one, which is a Bill Clinton painting, and it's this love seat, right? This little seat, and there is Bill Clinton in the seat, right? But not in a regular position, sort of lying down, right? And in a dress. Bill Clinton in a
Oh, I
dress.
did hear about that one.
Yeah, yeah, and he's pointing up. He's pointing his finger towards you, right? And this is not something that, I mean, no one denies this. This has been like in major news outlets,
Yeah,
right?
no, I did hear about the Clinton one. I hadn't heard about the Bush one. That's dark, man.
Yeah, that, well, they were both there. I mean, it's a weird thing, you know. I don't know what the conversations that these guys had together were like, right? Like that's what I'm really curious about is what are these guys like with each other behind closed doors, right? Because what we know that's open to the public and to everyone is already creepy as hell. It's already extremely weird. And so what happens, I mean, because the problem is like there's sort of what I like to call the tip of the iceberg theory, which is the idea that we get the tip of the iceberg, right? When we get news, we get a little snippet of reality, right? But it's so much larger than what people ever know and what people ever care to know, right? Because there's just too much information to people for people to take into consideration. So Pedophile Island, these weird images, the connections to royalty and presidents, it's weird enough. In terms of weather and all that stuff, I mean that I can't I don't even want to go there. I don't know.
Well, listen, man. What you just told me, like, let me tell you, it's you were describing the Bush thing, and it sounded fairly innocuous to me, right? Like he's drawing like a little kid and sitting on the floor and paper airplanes, and I'm like, you know, Bush was considered a bit of a dummy, you know, like, almost like a child running office, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of figured it was like, ah, maybe it sounds like a little knock. But when you said the Jenga thing, man, I was like, ooh, that one kind of hit for a second because I was in New York during 9/11, so it's like, oh boy, that's dark, man. And I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories too much because I have other stuff I want to talk to you about. But I mean, I had plenty about 9/11, and I don't doubt that the government either knew or somehow was involved, maybe knew and allowed it to happen. Kind of like a Pearl Harbor situation that gets talked about a lot. That the Americans knew Pearl Harbor was coming, but they allowed it to happen so we can get into the war, kind of deal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That's a tough one to hear, man. But I'm definitely gonna look into that a little bit. Um, and what about the current state? Like, so I wanted to ask you because I've been seeing on Twitter you've been a little more receptive to Andrew Yang, and I feel like since our last conversation, I've kind of stepped away from him a little more.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you that, and we did have that one conversation that we tried to record and didn't work out. I agree with you that he's probably the only guy who's really looking or at least talking about the AI problem and automation and all that. Um, but the UBI thing, the more and more I think about it, I'm like, I don't know if I like this idea, just because I don't know what, it's kind of like I was just looking at the thing that Trump is cutting a bunch of budget from certain things in the military. Like a lot of it is like schools that I guess get built in bases for the soldiers who take their families on with them. They're cutting a lot of that funding to pay for the wall, supposedly. I felt a little weird about that because I'm like, come on, man, these people go out there to risk their lives for us. The least you could do is make it so that they can provide for their families while they're there. Um, but at the same time, you do understand that where you give somewhere, you got to take from somewhere else. Um, where do you stand with Andrew Yang right now? Like, how do you feel about the UBI and his whole thing with AI? Because I kind of feel like it's good that he's the one guy talking about it, but the more I look at him, the less I tend to agree with him right now.
Right. Well, my whole perspective when it comes to politics and any area of politics is to just be completely, dumbfounded. To just be sort of like a person who just had a psychotic break and was called into a mental institution. The idea is there's way too many variables for anyone to take into consideration, right? The best you can do when you pick a political candidate is say that's good enough, right? Like it's good enough the understanding I have of this person versus the other people for me to decide that this is the person I'm going with. And I haven't really decided on anyone, right? I talk about Andrew Yang because I think that since he's so different, he is calling out issues that people really need to know about, right? I think that's why he has such an online following because people online, right, are more connected to Silicon Valley,
Right.
are connected to technology and artificial intelligence. And the experts on artificial intelligence are people that have a good idea, a good concept of what the consequences of this could potentially be. Which is why I talk about the idea that when you see someone like, climate experts and, talk about global warming and what's going on with the environment, people pay attention. When medical doctors, make some discovery that can, provide a relief or provide a vaccine for certain, diseases, then people pay attention. But when you hear the geniuses of Silicon Valley who are noticing the trends in artificial intelligence, who work with it every single day, whose life work it is to understand this stuff, and who are just looking at where this is taking us, when they warn us, we sort of shit on them. And that's a problem, right? And people sort of are sort of stuck in the idea of laughing at, like Terminator movies or whatever, the real extremist idea of something going horrific in terms of artificial intelligence. My view on it is a lot more, a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, the whole concept of artificial intelligence, for example, is just so unpredictable to me. And the reason why it's so unpredictable is because it contains within it so many possibilities, and because it can happen in such a short period of time, right? So change happens, exponentially quicker now than it did before. Right. Now, in terms of political candidates like Yang versus other political candidates, I don't know. And one of the biggest issues for me and for, I think, other voters, right, is that they want answers, right? Like, they want solutions that work, but they don't know if solutions are going to work. That's what most people don't know. When most people hear about universal basic income, or they hear about cutting taxes on the rich or raising taxes on the rich, they have no idea what it's going to do, because most people are not economists, and they haven't looked at any research that has to do with, the economics of a huge country like the United States, and how it could potentially be affected by things like this. Since we're not economists, we sort of have to just debate each other, and we don't really listen to the experts, right? If you listen, I mean, I don't think any rational economist in this day and age would agree at all with the notion of trickle-down economics. There's just not a shred of evidence that lowering taxes on the rich trickles down somehow to the poor. There's just zero evidence for that. Like, nothing, right? And so there's so much myth and bullshit and mysticism around economics, and economics is a huge part of what decides whether you're going to vote for one person or another. And then in terms of everything else, all the issues are incredibly complex. Like, it's something that you would need almost a PhD in every single one of these areas in order to be able to make a rational decision about who to choose. But we don't get that luxury because we don't have that time. And the extremists overall thrive in an environment of misinformation, because extremists are the ones with the loudest voices, right? So the moderates are listening and they're seeing what's going on, but they're not as loud. They're not as loud because they're more careful. They don't want to say a lot of bullshit. The extremists don't give a fuck. They promote ridiculous ideas, and they gain a huge following because they're just willing to say the most ridiculous shit, and people hear it, and it's what they pay attention to because it's ridiculous, it's loud, it's out there. I don't know who I'm gonna vote for in the Democratic primary. It would take something huge for me to consider even voting for Donald Trump in the re-election. I really do plan on voting for whoever the Democratic nominee is, but who I would vote in the Democratic primary to see who's going to be the actual candidate that goes against Trump, I don't know. I mean, in terms of Andrew Yang, I'm not sure how well he would do against a guy like Trump, right? I haven't seen him really get challenged versus other opponents the way that I've seen, people like Bernie Sanders get challenged, right?
Right.
For me to see it. I don't like the idea of Biden winning either, because Biden to me is just Obama 2.0, and I'm not really a fan of the Obama presidency. I think it gave us it really did increase the debt. Yeah, we did get out of a recession, but I mean, there's no such thing as a permanent recession. That's sort of the economic system we live in. We live in the boom bust cycle. I don't think presidents have as much to do with recessions as people think that they do, but it is what it is. In terms of who to vote for, I don't know. I'll let people make that decision. I'm still trying to figure out who I should vote for.
Listen, man, so you're definitely still on the fence, much like I am. I'm not sure. My feeling is that I don't. So for multiple reasons, but my main feeling right now is that there's no way we're not getting a second Trump term. Like we're definitely gonna get that. I don't think any of it's just the way the system is working right now. It's just who's louder, who's got the better sound bites and all that, and none of these guys are gonna be able to stand up to Trump. Like Trump is gonna eat them alive in debates. Even if he says nothing, he's gonna toy with them. But then on top of that, when you look historically, when do we ever really get like just a 4-year term? It almost never happens. Almost every single president gets reelected for that second term, and it's always a switch. The Republicans get 8 years, and then the Democrats get 8 years. It's rare that doesn't happen. I looked at the history of it, and so in my head, I'm like, look, it doesn't matter what we think is going to happen. They're going to give us another 8 years of these guys, of the same stuff. So I'm not necessarily, um, I'm not thrilled about any of the Democratic people, much like you, and I'm obviously not thrilled about Trump. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, I've been trying to do this thing where I'm trying to look at Trump's presidency a little more objectively, and I've been talking to more and more people that aren't necessarily like supporters of his, but um, do look at him in a slightly different light than just hating on the guy, because it's easy to hate on the guy, right? But um, it's real easy to hate on him, but I don't know when I. All right, so you look at his stance on China, right? I think it's a good stance, because if you really want to remain the most powerful country in the world, if you really don't want to be like you're playing second fiddle, or have a company, another country kind of take over, you kind of have to take the tough stance that he's taking. I get that. And there was something else that I looked into yesterday. I'm trying to remember it, but when I look at him right now, when I look at Trump, and I'm like, all right, as a human being, I don't want that dude. I wouldn't want anything to do with that dude. As a president, I don't really know, because like you said, it's too many variables to really understand what's happening. I do like that he does attack the mainstream media, excuse me, that he does attack the mainstream media, because it's not, when you look at a lot of what the media puts out, you're like, all right, like, it's that same thing that you always hear. You put on Fox, it's one side of it. You put on CNN, it's another side of it. You put on the next channel, it's their side of it. It's never the complete story. You almost have to watch all of them and kind of make your own decisions these days. But that being said, man, I kind of feel a lot like you. So my big thing with Andrew Yang is that, and I kind of caught this, is that because you brought up the trickle down economics, and I agreed that it hasn't worked, but he was talking about trickle up economics, and my issue with that is that sounds like a communist term. It sounds like a socialist term, right? And I've been battling with this idea for a while now about whether socialism and communism could work without the tyranny. And I'm getting more and more on the conclusion of like it can. It only works in small groups, maybe tribes, right? Where, people can come together as a group, maybe 20, 30 people, and kind of talk to each other about how they want to handle things, and that's that. And even then, it can get a little squirrely. Once the group starts getting larger and larger, people have different agendas all the time. Um, but the thing about Andrew Yang, and I always kind of said this. I said this on Twitter the other day. I was like, there was always, to me at least, there was always a little bit of a Trojan horse feel to his rhetoric, you know. And I get nervous now when I think about anything other than having like free speech, especially with all the things going on, all the doxing. There's that Google whistleblower that came out talking about the Google's role in meddling with the election and all that. I feel like I'm becoming almost more aligned with Republican ideals lately.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tough place to be in, because for the most part, I felt like a person who couldn't fit into any political party. But what are your thoughts on because that's what a lot of people are saying, obviously, about Bernie and Andrew Yang, is that they're just trying to sneak in socialism and communism, and being where your family came from. Have you considered that? Does that make you nervous at all?
Well, I, I always have an issue when people bring up terms like socialism and communism, right? When we bring up terms like that, I think it's really important for us to define what we mean by those terms, right? Because if not, then we could just be talking over each other. Now, in terms of communism, what I've seen in terms of communism is generally something that is impossible, right? Something that cannot work, right? What I've seen, the way that people have tried to apply communism in the nations that I've seen this happen, right? Cuba, the Soviet Union, Venezuela, etc., right? Is you get a government, right? And you leave it in charge of a very small group of people at the top, right?
Right.
Now, that small group of people has no checks and balances, right? There's no separation of governmental powers, right? There's no legislative, executive branch. It's just some asshole with a military outfit and the rest of his family doing whatever they want, right? So what ends up happening? Well, what have we done in the past in our so-called communist regimes? We get all of the resources, all the economic resources, and we hand them over to an extremely small group of people with no checks and balances. Now, if ever there was a way to turn someone into a tyrant, that was it. Because you have just, the whole premise of communism and socialism is to take away the burden of economic inequality, right? But what it does, in terms of how it's been applied, is create the largest amount of economic inequality ever, because you've just taken all of the resources of an entire nation and you've handed them over to a very small group of people who keep the majority of it for themselves and now, decide what they want to do with the rest, right? It is impossible for that to work, because if it's not a tyrant even in the beginning, eventually it will be a tyrant. You cannot end up in a situation where you give a small group of people infinite power and they end up using it wisely, right? I don't think anyone is good enough or smart enough to be able to pull that off, and I don't think that will ever work. Now, if someone has another definition or something else that they mean when they talk about socialism, communism, Marxism, right? We can talk about that. But that's what I've seen happen so far. And anyone who thinks that it's a good idea to implement that, to get rid of checks and balances and give all the resources to a really small group of people in the hope that they are going to be wise enough to distribute those resources, that's just a ridiculous idea, in my opinion.
Yeah, that to sort of kind of bring up the conspiracy side of it again, do you think, because this is another one I saw recently, I don't think there's a lot of traction behind it, but do you think that Yang is just a Trojan horse from China?
It's impossible to know. It's impossible
Right.
I mean, Bernie could be the same thing. People say, well, Bernie's been there for like 30 years and this and that. We don't know what's going to happen to Bernie once you get him into office. We don't know what's going to happen to anyone once they get into office. It's really hard for me to think that any politician is anything but a Trojan horse. But we have to see. My real worry isn't whether or not he's a Trojan horse. It's, what's under the wooden horse. How many troops are in there, and how bad is it going to be? That's what I'm worried about, because it's impossible to know, right? Because politicians say they want to do, X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z might get implemented, but it's not just whether or not something is implemented, it's how it's implemented, right? Obama wanted universal health care, right? And we got sort of Obamacare, but it was so watered down by the other political party and the whole battle and the bureaucracy that got in the way that what we were left with is something that really disappointed a lot of people, even people that supported him. So when things get watered down, which they do in a bureaucracy, which is one of the side effects of checks and balances, which are necessary no matter how you know, how many negative consequences they bring along with it. They're necessary because otherwise you're left with a tyrant, like we just talked about before. It's something that we have to face. Now, which president is least likely to be a Trojan horse? I don't know. You know, because if the horse looks real good, people are
People are
going to
gonna
push
buy
for
it.
it. People are going to support it.
Yeah. Well, to switch gears a little bit here. First off, quick shout out to Brian Stone from Contortion. Shout out
Oh, sure.
to Contortion and their whole band. I know they're out on tour right now.
Mhm.
Episode 2 of my podcast was, and I know you had a conversation with him on your podcast.
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
it's out on YouTube. Um, there's a there's a thing we were talking about at the end of our conversation that got cut off. Hopefully, we get to do that second one whenever, if he gets a break during tour or after his tour or whatever. Um, we were talking about meditation. We're starting to get into meditation a lot, and I know that that's something that you've played with and have done. I know you've done martial arts and stuff. Um, and I wanted to, because I had mentioned to you on Twitter once, I was like, look, anything can be meditation, right? Like the most common one is obviously like the stuff that maybe like Sam Harris is pushing, all this like, sort of awareness, kind of pay attention to your breath and let your thoughts come and go. Don't focus on them. Like, the basic, the putting your focus into one thing basically. And I kind of mentioned to you that, from my perspective, anything can be meditated, right?
Mhm.
And so I use the example for, a good one that you'll probably appreciate, which is martial arts, right? When you are, doing like practicing martial arts, let's say you are on, you walk into your gym or your dojo or whatever, and it's sparring day. In that moment of sparring, there's nothing else can exist, right? Like, somebody's slinging knuckles and feet or whatever at your face, or is trying to, sink in their arm right under your throat so they can get a choke or whatever. There's really nothing that can exist other than that moment, right? There's nothing that can exist other than, where are my hands? Where's my body in relation to my opponent's body? Where am I in which position am I least vulnerable and able to inflict the most damage? In those moments where your bills don't matter, where um, whatever argument you have with a friend or spouse or partner, or your whatever your financial situation, your job situation, nothing matters. The universe, whatever you contemplate, if you're a person who sits around contemplating the universe doesn't matter at that moment. The only thing that matters is, don't get choked, don't get hit, right? Um, and that to me is meditative, right? Like, if you do something like archery, for example, um, that can be meditative, because you can't do anything but focus on your posture, the positioning of your hands, where you're trying to aim, and the release of that arrow. Because if any of those things is off, your shot is off. If anything other than the focus on the moment is off in sparring, you're probably gonna get choked or hurt, right? Um, I look at meditation as something that could be done even in like reading, if you're or writing. Say you're a good writer, and you're writing, and you get lost in your writing, and you enter what's called the flow states, which is what I really want to talk to you about. Um, Anything that you do that can focus you to a point where you enter a flow state, I think is meditative. And being that you're someone who seems multifaceted, I mean, you've done martial arts, you're trying to do a YouTube channel, you're studying psychology and all these things. First off, what do you know about flow states? Have you ever been in them? And what do you think about this idea that I just put forth, like that anything can be meditative if you're focused solely on it?
Well, I think everyone's been in flow states, whether they recognize it or not, right? The natural state for people, right? The regular state of consciousness is usually one of just distraction, right? So you're having all this input, all this stimulus from your environment that you're perceiving through your senses, and you also have neural connections going off in your brain, which just